Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rabbi Melanie Lavav, and I have the honor of being here today with my excellent colleague, Carly Coons. Shomer Collective and the Blue Dove Foundation have come together to do this work, and we are blessed to have all of you in attendance with us and those of you watching on the recording. I want to offer a few words of gratitude as we wait for more folks to join and get started. Of course, to our friends and colleagues at the Blue Dove Foundation and to UpStart, who provided us with the opportunity to collaborate through the collaboration grant program that brought us together for this project, to our many reviewers who have reviewed all the content in our resource guides. And I want to offer some gratitude to the Be Well initiative of JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, for reviewing the resource, for promoting it through the Resiliency Roundtable. Thanks to all of our peers in the mental health and Jewish communal fields who have reviewed the resource and supported its creation. And of course, words of gratitude to each of you who have contributed to our work by talking about the traumatic losses that you have suffered personally, professionally in your communities that have helped to shape our work. An important special thanks to Dr. Betsy Stone for reviewing every word of the resources and helping to strengthen the application of Jewish wisdom in addressing mental health. We will introduce our guest speakers who also have my gratitude today in just a few minutes. What I want to start with is to ground our work in some Jewish wisdom. And as I'm doing this, if you're just joining us, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you're located geographically, if you're affiliated with an organization, which one, and what brought you here today. Why are you here today? And so to ground us in Jewish wisdom, we ask the question, why are we talking about this, about traumatic loss, about traumatic deaths in Jewish spaces? There are no easy answers, but we'll attempt to address the questions with perhaps even more questions. So death happens. It happens in ways we can more easily understand, like in cases of old age, and in too many ways that we cannot possibly understand. And this idea of things happening that we can't understand, this is part of what motivated us to come together in this work, the realization that for all of the Jewish wisdom that's available to us on the subject of life and death, in the face of a traumatic death or a death out of time, a phrase that Dr. Betsy Stone offered to us, it is often difficult to take in what Jewish wisdom has to offer, even as it is meant to provide comfort. And what is the it that it's meant to comfort? We have story after story in Jewish tradition that are meant to address the questions that have few or no answers following traumatic deaths. We have rituals to provide comfort to the mourners. And while our presence with mourners may provide some measure of comfort, the idea that we are not alone in this, sometimes there are questions that simply remain without answers. Like, why did this person die in this way? Why now? Why in such a traumatic way? And so I turned to the wisdom of our tradition, and I wanted to offer two brief stories today from Jewish wisdom to illustrate historically our people's attempt to acknowledge that traumatic death happens and that there are questions that we continue to struggle with. The first is from the book of Job. Job is an example of Jewish wisdom available to us from which we might learn something about traumatic death. It was written in the last few centuries before the Common Era. And the book of Job is largely concerned with the question of why God allows bad things to happen. The idea of the book of Job, of why do bad things happen, was taken up by Rabbi Harold Kushner, who recently died. In the 80s, he wrote a book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. You may be familiar with it. In the book, Kushner suggests a theology, an understanding of God as inherently good, but not necessarily all-powerful. This idea of God being inherently good, but not necessarily all-powerful, it may or may not work for you or the folks you work with if you're a professional. But I want to share an excerpt from the book of Job, from chapter 1. It goes like this. One day, as his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, the kids got together for a meal, a messenger came to Job and said, the ox were plowing and the she-goats were grazing when they were attacked. And the attackers led the boys to the sword, meaning Job's sons were killed. And the messenger says, I alone escaped to tell you. And the messenger was still talking to Job when another one came and said, God's fire fell from heaven, took hold of the sheep and the boys and burned them up. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And this messenger was still speaking when another one came and said, a group of enemies raided the camels and carried them off and put the boys to the sword, meaning kill them. And I alone have escaped to tell you. And this messenger was still speaking when another one came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, when suddenly a mighty wind came from the wilderness. It struck the four corners of the house so that it collapsed upon the young people and they died. I alone have escaped to tell you. Then Job arose, tore his robe, cut off his hair, and threw himself on the ground and prayed. He said, naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. God has given, and God has taken away. Blessed be God's name. And so that's the excerpt I wanted to share with you from the book of Job. All of these messengers came to tell Job of the death of his children. And what does he do in response? Tears his robe, throws himself on the ground. Understandable reaction. But the text records his verbal response as one in which he acknowledges the reality of mortality. Naked I came into this world, and so too I will return. Okay, maybe this is helpful, but this idea God has given, God has taken, blessed be God's name, this traditional Jewish theological response might provide comfort for some, and for others it may be too much, too soon. As we go through acute experiences of grief in the face of traumatic death, with anger and resentment, many well-meaning people may try to offer such theological or other responses. Our job is to remember that there exist many questions without answers, that there may be no knowable reason for a traumatic death. This idea of a great wind coming and the house collapsing on his children, trapping them inside, it reminds me of the horrible stories we hear of natural disasters causing traumatic deaths, hurricanes, floods, trees falling on bunks after being hit by lightning at summer camp. Why do these things happen? Kushner's book title offers us a clue. It's not asking in the title, why do bad things happen to good people, but rather offering when bad things happen to good people. Sometimes death just is, and there are no good answers in the innumerable questions. And the second story I want to share to illustrate Jewish wisdom on this incomprehensible question, the nature of traumatic death, is that of a woman named Bruria. Her story is found in Midrash, or post-biblical rabbinic imaginings or commentary by the rabbis. Bruria was a well-learned wife. She knew a lot of Rabbi Meir. And while Rabbi Meir was teaching at the Beit Midrash, at the house of study, one Shabbat afternoon, the story goes, both of his sons died from a plague that was affecting their city. And when Meir returned home after Shabbat, he didn't know what had happened at home. He asked his wife, where are our sons? And she handed him a cup of wine for Havdalah, the ceremony of separation between Shabbat and the rest of the week. And he said the blessings. Again, he said, where are our sons? And she brought him food and he ate. And when he finished eating, Bruria said to her husband, I have a question. A while ago, a man came and he deposited something precious in my keeping. Now he's come back to claim what he left. Shall I return it to him or not? Meir responded, is not one who holds a deposit required to return it to its owner? Right? We've got a whole body of Jewish law discussions in the Talmud about making sure that lost things get back to their owners. And so she took his hand and she led him to where their two sons laid. He began to weep, crying, my sons, my sons. She comforted him, saying, God gave, God took. Yehei Shmei Rabba Mevorach. May God's name be blessed. Again, centuries later, we see this theology at play, that some things are beyond human comprehension. In these two cases, the idea of children dying before their parents. If you're familiar with the 12 steps from your work in substance use disorder and recovery, perhaps as a professional or personally, you might recognize this idea of giving it over to God as the third of the 12 steps. It may work for many, and it's deeply rooted in Jewish ideas and this bigger body of Judeo-Christian theology, and yet some of us may not be able to get behind this idea with our contemporary minds, certainly not in the immediate wake of a traumatic death. And so where does that leave us? What I find most comforting in the face of questions without answers is the realization that I'm not alone in asking these questions, like, why did she die suddenly? Talking about my curiosity with other colleagues following the death of another colleague a while back, a colleague who was not much older than me in the same stage of life. It's part of what led us to this project, the project of helping people through traumatic deaths, or asking the questions that have few or incomplete answers, and to do so guided by centuries of Jewish wisdom. When I was training as a chaplain during rabbinical school, one of my teachers offered a theology of suffering that I found helpful then working in a cancer hospital, and I continue to lean on it in the face of traumatic deaths. This idea that God is here with us in our suffering, that God is at the bedside, that God too is experiencing the loss of human life. Again, this idea that we're not alone. We may or may not like all the things people say to us to try to provide comfort, nor may we agree with any of the many Jewish stories meant to offer consolation. But this idea that we're not alone, that the immediate survivors of a traumatic death are not alone, that others have been here, that we each have a role to play, even if we're several layers removed, this is vital to the work, to the obligations we have to attend to the mourners and to care for our communities. And so it's with this in mind, the richness of our tradition and exploring the questions that have no easy answers, and the value of the rituals in which we come together to acknowledge that none of us is completely alone, even as we feel the depth of isolation and acute grief. This is why we're talking about traumatic death in Jewish spaces. Carly, all yours.
Thank you so much for grounding this conversation in Judaism and reminding us why we're having these conversations in Jewish spaces. This webinar today is called Quieting the Silence, Jewish Responses to Traumatic Death. And this term, quieting the silence, is something that we use a lot at the Blue Dove. It's one of our flagship programs where it's a play on words. We are quieting the silence by having conversations about topics that we usually shy away from to hopefully break down stigma and normalize conversation. And that's our intention with these guides, is to normalize this conversation around traumatic death and the way that it impacts us as individuals and as communities. And so a note as we continue on in this webinar that we will be talking about sensitive topics, and we know that you are each whole people coming with your own experiences. So we invite you to take care of yourselves today in whatever way that you need, and to use this space however you need it today. We're going to start with defining some terms. So we're sort of making sure we're talking about the same thing and coming to this with the same understanding. So we'll start with trauma, sort of the core of what it is we're talking about. The definition that really resonated with us as we created these guides is this one here. That trauma is the response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope, causes feelings of helplessness, and diminishes their sense of self and their ability to feel the full range of emotions and experiences. So trauma is really something that disrupts our safety, whether it is an event that we have experienced or a perceived threat to our safety. It can impact us in ways that perhaps we can't imagine or think of. And it's a very unique experience. What is traumatic or distressing for one person might not be the same for someone else. The way we are affected by trauma, our response to it can be very different from others. And our timeline of a trauma response can be very different. Some people might have an immediate impact, and some people may not for months or years. And so there's a lot of validation in knowing that it is a unique journey, but it can also be frustrating because there is no one roadmap that we are following as we are experiencing traumatic events or traumatic death. And what we're, as Melanie talked about, what we're really thinking about here is a traumatic death out of time. There are so many deaths that can be traumatic to an individual. And what we are really thinking of in particular are ones that happen, sort of this phrase that Dr. Betsy Stone helped us think of, happen out of time. These often feel different from deaths that occur after a long illness or an advanced age. These are ones that perhaps we can't anticipate happening. And so many things fall into this category. An overdose, a suicide, when a child dies, a natural disaster, a car accident, an act of terror, shootings, and so many other things. But that's really what we're thinking about, are when these traumatic deaths that happen out of time, how does that impact us as individuals, us as professionals, us as supporters of grievers? How does it impact our whole community? And traumatic events have a huge impact on us, both as individuals and communities. They impact our physical health, our emotional health. Those two are so greatly intertwined that when one is suffering, the other is often as well. And these symptoms all happen differently. So as you look at our guide, as you read through it, you will see that there are more details. We have cited our sources and footnotes on the bottom of each page to really encourage people and individuals to read more and to learn more. And the other thing we really want to think about today is secondhand trauma. So secondhand trauma being the trauma that perhaps we have not directly experienced, but that has impacted us. You don't have to directly experience a traumatic event to suffer from those symptoms of trauma. So even the threat of a traumatic event happening or hearing someone share their experience can be enough to trigger those symptoms. And so often, as we are in the roles of supporting the people around us, supporting communities, supporting our individuals, we also have to create that time and space to think about how we can support ourselves. And so that's our hope here today too, is that we will begin to think about that a little bit as we are sharing and hearing stories together today. So I want to introduce our first speaker. We will do a question and answer after our speakers speak today. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat and we will address them once both of our speakers have had a chance to share their stories. Our first speaker is Ruby Falk. Ruby is an individual and relational therapist who focuses on supporting couples through the postpartum phase and grief and loss. She approaches therapy through a family systems lens, exploring how past relationships with family members and friends have shaped your experience with the world. After the sudden and traumatic loss of her father in 2015, Ruby decided to pursue a career in therapy and entered graduate school at the University of Colorado in Denver in 2018. She has a private practice that is centered on relational therapy. She lives just outside of Denver with her husband and 2 kids. Ruby, thank you so much for being here today, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really, really excited and honored to be a part of this discussion. I think so. When Carly approached me about having this conversation, one of the first things that came up for me was, like instantly came up for me, was how when someone is lost to a traumatic death, for me, I lost my dad to suicide, and I found that he instantly became reduced to the way that he died. That like nothing else about his life mattered, and not just to the public or anyone outside, but to myself as well. That like I just sort of shifted my entire narrative about who he was and my relationship with him, and his relationship with my sister and my mom was just, none of that mattered. It all just became about the way that he died. I think that's something that's really significant and important here, and probably relatable to other people who have lost loved ones too. I use the word unsavory because I think there is a level of shame and embarrassment in sharing when you have lost someone to suicide or to overdose, in a way that doesn't necessarily exist with other losses. So and it was interesting, something, Rabbi Melanie, that you mentioned about curiosity and leaning into this curiosity, that I noticed needing to sort of be patient with other people and giving them this grace of their curiosity when there is an untimely or an out of time, out of turn death, that like you instantly go to this place of, well, why? How did this happen? How could this happen? This, you know, your dad was younger than me. Like these were all things that I was asked. And it took me years to accept that as like just a very human response to someone dying suddenly, unexpectedly, and them wanting to know the reason why. At first, I was deeply, depends on who it comes from. I can still be deeply insulted by it, but, and how it's framed. But at first, I was very insulted and hurt and, you know, was like, why does this matter? And now I just think it is this, a human wondering that I try to leave space for, and I process like on my own with other people in my circle. Something else that I think is worth noting here as well from this Jewish lens, I think the rituals around death and dying and supporting mourners in Judaism is like one of my favorite parts about being a Jew. I think it is so well done and thoughtful and intentional. And I also, and I never would have expected this until experiencing it myself, was something I wanted absolutely nothing to do with when I lost my dad, because it is about so much togetherness and instant funeral, instant Shiva. You are surrounded by people. And like, that was the last thing I wanted. I refused to be around people after losing my dad. I refused to like, I think we sat Shiva one day and I was like, this is something I want absolutely nothing to do with. And so I think that's something interesting to address as well, is this idea of like, this is such a Jewish value of ours to, you know, surround the mourners and to bring food and to just, you're not alone. We're here, we're with you, we are in this with you. But like, that doesn't always help. And is something that like kind of caught me off guard when I was experiencing it myself, was this idea that like, I don't want to be around anyone. I still haven't accepted this and can't believe this is happening. And now I have to like talk to all these people as I'm, you know, throwing dirt on my dad's casket. So I think those are the two primary things for me, were the way that someone is reduced to the way that they die when it is a traumatic loss, and that how the Jewish customs, as well-meaning and beautiful as they are, can kind of be a lot for someone who lost someone traumatically and suddenly. And so maybe shifting the conversation about like, okay, if I can't show up in a Jewish way for this person, then what might that look like? Full disclosure, I'm still trying to figure that out. I don't know. What were the other things I wanted to? Oh, the secondhand trauma that you talked about, Carly. This is also something that's really important, is that yes, the mourners, those like immediate grievers, I will call them, could be put on a pedestal in terms of like hierarchy, who needs what, but you do yourself a disservice to ignore the ways that this also impacts you, even if it's not directly a loss that you are experiencing. If it is a loss that a loved one of yours is experiencing, you have every right to be in pain and sad. And like, all you want to do is absorb that pain for them and take it away for them. And that powerlessness that you feel, in that you like, the one thing that you want to do. I'm using my husband as an example because I really struggled to explain to him, you know, he would ask like, well, you were okay an hour ago and now you're really upset. And I was just like, I don't know how to like articulate this for you. And it was, I had him come to therapy with me to like have my therapist in a more articulate way share for him what this experience was like. And instead, she shared for me, she shared for him what this experience was like for him, which totally changed everything for me. And I will never forget what she said. She was like, your husband is watching you be brutally beaten while someone is holding his hands behind his back. And like, there is nothing he can do about it. And that absolutely changed the way that I let him in. I allowed him to like grieve with me. I left space for his process as well. And I think it's important for the griever to do, and it's also important for you to give yourself permission that while this may not be your direct loss, you can also feel sad and hurt by watching someone you love be sad and hurt. Yeah, I think I made that in under 7 minutes, but
Ruby, thank you so much. That was so beautiful. And I want to in particular thank you for sharing a story that we don't often have the privilege to hear, and helping normalize what your experience felt like. And I noticed while you were talking, I saw many head nods as you were sharing. So thank you so much for sharing. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to hearing more during the question answer from you.
yeah, thank you.
And I'd love to introduce our next speaker, Mark Young. Mark is the Vice President of Talent Strategy and Director of J-Response at JCC Association of North America. J-Response is JCC Association's signature program that trains JCC professionals to respond to crisis and deploys to JCC communities after disaster. Mark holds a dual master's degree in nonprofit management and Judaic studies from New York University, a bachelor's degree from McGill University. He is the author of Bless Our Workforce, Changing the Way We Manage Our People. He lives in Hartsdale, New York with his wife, Rabbi Mara Young, their daughter Noah, their son Asher, and their rescue dog Lucky. Thank you so much, Mark, for being here with us today.
Thank you, Carly. I want to just thank Ruby for proceeding what I think might be more of a practical application of how we help others and help ourselves navigating traumatic death. But I want to just hold the incredible sharing and stories, Ruby, that you just shared with us, and also the framing that Rabbi Melanie that you shared as well. As Carly mentioned, part of my job as director of J-Response is to work with professionals to respond to crisis that doesn't necessarily always involve traumatic death, but can also involve traumatic death. And what I'm going to share with you is some of the work that we do with professionals, but I want to honor that these practical applications or these strategies could be done as a friend, as a lay person, as any member of the community. And I recognize that we have a wonderful, diverse audience of professionals and friends and colleagues and lay people here, and hope you find value in what I'm going to share. I'm going to use a slide deck. I'm going to start the slideshow. There's a lot more text on the slideshow that I'm going to reference. So I apologize in advance if I go a little bit quick. I want to be honoring of the time, and I'll focus on the certain things that I think are really important for this conversation. So let me just get my PowerPoint up, and I will share the screen. I think I've already shared it. Can everyone, Carly, we can see? Great. So just as a framing, J-Response is part of JCC Association of North America. JCC Association of North America is the umbrella organization that supports Jewish community centers and leads Jewish community centers and Jewish community camps across North America, the 170 agencies. And there are 55,000 professionals that work at JCCs, whether full-time, part-time, or seasonal. And hundreds of those professionals have been trained as J-responders in our signature program and talent initiative, J-Response, which I'll talk more about. J-Response aims to respond to disasters, but there's a broader why. And I think it's relevant to the work of connecting with people after traumatic death, because though it is about supporting people that have navigated those that have had a traumatic death in their network or in their family, it really is about building bridges. And I think it's about elevating that person and elevating ourselves. And it's about strengthening. It's about the positive possibilities when we are there for each other, when we can be there for each other during these times of immense challenge. And I'll mention that J-Response, one of its major deployments was to Pittsburgh several weeks, and again, a year after the Tree of Life synagogue shooting. Though it didn't happen, it happened in the synagogue, not the JCC. The JCC was an immense community connector during those difficult times. And we came to support the broader community. And I think it's poignant to have this conversation now as the trial for the shooting is happening now. And that's reliving for many people the effects of the traumatic death that they experienced back in 2018. Our work is grounded in Jewish values. I think it's important to say that responding to traumatic death is not something that is exclusively Jewish, but I think there's something uniquely Jewish about it, which I think Rabbi Melanie framed as well. We bring Jewish texts into our training and into our practice. Here I just highlight values that are not maybe exclusively Jewish values, but have a unique Jewish connection to this. That if you are navigating traumatic death, and if you are helping someone else navigate traumatic death, that remembering that we're all created in the image of the divine, that we're all commanded to perform acts of loving kindness, that we're all responsible for one another, and that we're doing the work of Tov. Tov is good in Hebrew, but it also means being of use. So how might we help other people be of use, and how might we be of use to others when they're navigating something incredibly challenging, such as traumatic death, whether we've experienced that as well or not. With J-Response, we've developed this virtuous cycle, and I call it a virtuous cycle because J-Response is meant to be something positive, something helpful during this time of challenge, and it's the 4 R's: readiness, relief, recovery, and resilience. I'm going to speak about each because I think for this conversation, it's important for us as we might prepare for something that is untimely or out of time, as Dr. Betsy Sohn has said, or something that might affect us at any point. How might we prepare for it? How might we have the skills to be resilient in the face of it, both before, during, and after? And how might we have the framework that when we're helping others provide either initial relief during that difficult time or long-term recovery, that there are things that we can apply. And again, these are many hours of training and discussion that I'm putting in just a couple of minutes. So forgive me if I'm just highlighting, and we'll happily expand on anything I'm sharing during the Q&A portion. So for readiness, obviously this is our READY model is not just about traumatic death, it's about responding to any number of crises. We have a READY model, and I really want to focus in this moment on relationships and your team, which is kind of our shorthand for training. Thinking about the relationships that you have in your work, personal life. Who are the people that you can rely upon should a challenge or stress happen, or should a challenge or stress happen to somebody else and you're there for them and you might be experiencing vicarious or secondhand trauma? What are the relationships that you can identify now when you might not necessarily be in a position of navigating or helping someone else navigate traumatic death? And how might you prepare yourself otherwise? I think being here today is a wonderful example of the readiness that we are all doing, so we are in the best possible case we can be to support others or even ourselves should traumatic death fall upon our network, our life, our family. Resilience. I encourage you after this webinar to go to moodmeter.com. There's an app as well. This is from Yale School of Social Emotional Learning. It's very difficult to know how to start a conversation, either with ourselves or with others, when we're navigating these Shiva experiences. And though, my parent didn't pass away from a traumatic death, it was still very sad. And I resonated when Ruby shared that the last thing I wanted to be was at a Shiva when I was mourning my mom. But checking in with ourselves, even just saying, how am I feeling today? Or saying, how are you feeling today? And here are some words that you can point to, is a great way for us to build resilience, because we're identifying how we feel. And if we identify how we feel or help others identify how they feel, then they can start a path of, okay, how can they do something about that? How can they respond to that? Maybe not immediately, but over time. So we've developed within J-Response a 4 I's model of resilience. And I'll just say for the moment, it's identifying where we're at, which we constantly have to do. It's interpreting what that means and what might need nurturing. Is it in the body? Is it in the mind? Is it spiritual needs? Is it social needs at that time? Practicing it, anything from deep breathing to exercise to gratitude journal. And I'll share these constructive habits. Sound common sense and obvious. They're often the things that we don't want to do or don't prioritize when we're in a challenging, stressful, or navigating traumatic death situation. So all the more so, we or others need to help us, or we need to help others practice those constructive habits. And also reflecting, because navigating a traumatic death or helping others might feel very different in the immediacy versus 3, 6 months, 1 year, 10 years after, when we're still navigating those times as well. And then there's relief and recovery. And I want to focus your eyes to the middle of this slide. What are our roles if we're trying to support people who are navigating challenge, stress, or traumatic death? We've worked with our colleagues at IsraAid, out of Israel's fantastic humanitarian relief organization. It talks about 3 goals, and this is in their framework of psychological first aid: restore feelings of safety, reduce stress, and regulate emotions. It's not make it all better. We can't. It's not telling them to feel better, because we can't. We don't know how they feel. Everyone experiences this differently. But if we can help them feel safe, help them their stress be reduced even a little bit, and help their emotions regulate a little bit, then that's the way forward. And further training can help us do that. I encourage everyone, if you haven't already been through a course in mental health first aid with the National Council for Mental Wellbeing, it is a great resource to understand how we support people that are navigating a traumatic situation. And I'll focus your eyes on the 2nd and 3rd bullet point: how we listen non-judgmentally, and how we give reassurance and information. Just being present and just saying, I'm here, I don't even know what to say, but I'm here, is perhaps one of the most powerful things any of us can do when we're with other people who are navigating a traumatic death related experience. And then the last thing I'll say, probably over time, is that there's the initial period, and then there's the long term, there's the recovery. To know that we can never go back before the event. We talk about in natural disasters or in man-made disasters, there's never going back to the way things were. It's just not possible. But there is a way forward. There is a way. How can we help somebody in the long term appreciate life, see new possibilities, find personal strength, find spiritual change? This is called post-traumatic growth. And that is something that acknowledges that the past can't be changed, but there can be a new future at some point. And that's the recovery piece that we go to. So that's just a little bit about the work of J-Response and how we respond to disaster, and how we particularly respond during situations where people we're working with are navigating traumatic death. Ultimately, we don't want to do any harm, just being there and knowing that if you are in a position to help somebody, that you're not alone. You have the Blue Dove Foundation, you have Shomer Collective, you have their guides, you have J-Response, you have your family, your colleagues. We are all in a larger team to help ourselves and others navigate these difficult situations. So I focus on empathy, I focus on presence, and I applaud the work of Shomer Collective and Blue Dove, and really appreciate being in this conversation today.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you, Mark, for sharing the work that you're doing for the Jewish community at large, and also helping us think about ways that we can take that work and apply it to our lives at any scale. We really appreciate that.
So the first question we have is for you, Mark, about whether there are ways for folks who are not on the staff of a JCC to get involved with J-Response in the community.
So I'd love to have a conversation with you, Al. You know, the simple answer would be no, we're not right now, because it's really focused on training our professionals. And we've had exploratory conversations of how we can involve lay leadership or how we can involve the broader community. And we're kind of at that stage for that exploration. So if you're interested in getting involved in some way, I'll make sure you get my contact information. I'll put it in the chat, and I'd love to explore that with you.
Thanks, Mark. The next question, Ruby, I'm going to ask you to start with is it ever appropriate when the loss is that of an older person to ask, were they very ill?
I hate this answer, but I think it depends. I would say depends maybe on the like nature of your relationship with the person that you are asking. Yeah, I think it just depends on the nature of the relationship. Because I don't think it's an unfair question to ask, but there are sensitivities around it for each person.
I think part of the work here is to recognize where our curiosity comes up and what's our primary responsibility in the moment. So if we are attending to the person who has suffered the tremendous loss, a traumatic death, how can we find a place for our curiosity that may not be directed at them? And so one of the ideas that exists in the resource guide that Carly will take us on a brief tour of, and maybe some of you have already downloaded, is this idea of placing the person who survives the traumatic death at the center, and then a series of concentric circles around them, and that we provide comfort in, and we take our curiosity and our own needs and we bring them out to a bigger level of this idea of concentric circles. So we seek our support, we share our curiosity with people who are further removed from the situation, although certainly expressing care in the form of questions can be appreciated, to think about when is the right place to do that. Other questions, I see some discussion in the chat about how to find the app. So here's another one. When a person who's lost a loved one seems ready to talk about their feelings, what's the best way to start the conversation?
Is that to me?
Sure.
I like that question a lot, because I think it's a really big step when someone lost someone traumatically and suddenly, and they feel ready to talk about it. So like leaning in with questions about, like, tell me about this person, like share some of your memories, like what about your relationship with, like, what made you laugh, what are, the happy things, I think, are the happy memories. It is not uncommon for those to be the first to go when you have lost someone, again, in this like unsavory way. And so getting to this point of like ready to talk about it is great to lean into. So like asking them to share some of your favorite memories you have with this person, like inside jokes, asking them to explain these jokes, things like that.
I think to go off of that too, Ruby, when somebody is ready to talk and share, if you have memories that you can share, I think there's something also so beautiful maybe of rehearing a story or hearing a story you've never heard before.
Yep.
And I think especially, you're right, as you lose some of those memories as time goes on, and as a response to trauma, getting to gain some of those back and have that insight, I think fills your cup up in a way that you perhaps couldn't have done on your own.
Totally. And also kind of alleviates that burden of like, is the responsibility solely on me to remember this person and to like honor and do all of these things to keep their memory alive? And the answer to that is no.
Yeah, I'll only add that it's good to check in to see if they actually are ready, because they might be ready, or you think they might be ready, but they might not. So statements such as, I'm here for you. If you're ready to talk, I am here. And if you just want me to be here, I am here as well. And then the only other thing to think about is when you're asking questions or sharing memories, recognizing that it's about them and it's not about us. It's sometimes easy for us to make this about our own needs, and our own needs are important. But how do we make sure that we let them speak? And if we're saying something, is it in service to them?
Thanks.
I think that comes back to those concentric circles that Rabbi Melanie was talking about, that when we are with that immediate griever, we are leaning in to support them, and then we are leaning out to get our own support, and finding the things we need, because it is equally as important to take care of ourselves. We can't pour into somebody else's glass if our glass is empty. So what is helping us feel nourished and cared for, so that we too then can go and care for the person who is that immediate griever.
Yes. Beth, I see your hand.
Hi. So as a Hillel professional, the majority of death cases that I deal with in my work are typically like a pretty like strong, like a binary between like grandparent who like dies of natural causes, or like car accident, suicide, something very, very horrible and very, very, very deeply traumatic. When like I know that we don't have a ton of control over our gut reaction, but like when we hear these things, is there any other way that is appropriate to respond other than "I'm so sorry, that is truly terrible"? Like, are there any other words that are appropriate when we hear about those very, very, very sudden tragic deaths?
I also appreciate that question, because I'll tell you what I wouldn't say is I can't imagine, because you can imagine. and like it makes you uncomfortable to imagine, and so you don't want to, but you can imagine what it's like. That was something that bothered me. I also heard I had joined like some grief support groups, and I remember people saying that it like really bothered them that people were like, "Oh my God, I'm so deeply sorry for your loss." And I was like, I just thought that was weird. I'm like, what else are you supposed to say? I don't know. I think saying that from like a place of like, okay, I know this wasn't your question, but another thing that I wouldn't say is let me know if there's something I can do for you, because it's sort of putting the burden of like you come up with like a list of the things that you need. It's like putting that on. It's like one more thing that they have to figure out and do. So either saying like, I am here for in this extremely painful time, like it doesn't make me uncomfortable and I want to be here for you. I think that's something too that people experience with traumatic loss, is this fear of making people uncomfortable. Um, Again, with these, you know, unsavory deaths where society has not really accepted that it's okay to die by, it's, well, you know what I mean by it's okay to die by suicide, that it's or an overdose or something that's just not a part of this, where our knee-jerk reaction isn't, oh how sad, it's more like, geez, what was wrong?
Mm.
That's where we go. And so telling this person like, you are not making me uncomfortable, I am here for you through this, and I'm so deeply sorry, I think is a great way to show like solidarity with them, if
Mm.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Beth, I would just add that not, I mean, just like humans, like we all have different reactions. And sometimes you don't need even words. You know, if you can be physically present with them or virtually present with them, just saying, I'm here. And like that means, I think, can mean tremendous much. I resonate with what Ruby said, is that try not to put something on them, even though it sounds like you're being helpful, because they don't know what they need yet. And they're probably dealing with a whole bunch of other logistics that they just don't want to be dealing with, for lack of a better, you know, even more so. If it's an appropriate response, you can say, I love you, if it's depending on the relationship. And I really do love when we talk about someone who has passed, we say zichronon levracha, or may their memory be for a blessing. It may not be something people want to hear in the immediate, but to know that that person that's passed will be a blessing, or will be a legacy, or will be giving light and life in some way post their physical life, is, in my mind, is hopeful and is inspirational. To say that, you know, their memory is going to be a blessing, their life is going to be a blessing. It gives almost that person who is no longer physically with us more purpose and more ways to positively impact others. So that's another thought.
I want to offer, along the lines of what Mark just introduced, two other pieces of Jewish tradition in terms of the words that we use to respond. And then I'm going to turn it over to Carly to give us a brief tour of the resource guides. The first, traditionally, when we hear of a death, we say Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the judge of truth. And this can be problematic theologically for some people, in the idea that God is the one who judges what is true and what is not true, meaning that there was a reason for the death of someone who died in a traumatic circumstance. And there are ways to interpret that idea of there's truth in the world, and we may not always know what it is at the time that we wish we did, that could be more helpful. And the other is a set of words that we say to the mourner, usually traditionally in a house, in a Shiva house, upon leaving the Shiva house. We say in Hebrew, this is an Ashkenaz custom. In English, it's translated as, may you be comforted among the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. So we're offering comfort in the acknowledgement, may you be comforted among the other mourners, right? Again, it's that idea of you're not alone. And so I think even when we feel like we made a mistake and didn't say the right words, the fact that we show up in some way, whether it's through a text or an email or a hug or a Shiva visit or any of those kinds of things, is perhaps even more important than getting the exact words right. Carly, all yours.
Thank you. And to sort of sum that up, I think thinking about the fact that trauma impacts us all so differently. So we might not even be able to anticipate what will be the right or wrong thing somebody could say to us. And I've seen a lot of great comments and conversation in the chat around this and being present. And that's what we really hope that this guide will help empower us to do. And so I'm going to do a little quick tour of the guide as we wrap up our time together today. So I will share my screen. Can we see that okay? Excellent. So we have two guides that we have created. The intention was one and the reality was two. As we were doing the work, we realized there was more than one need, which was absolutely okay. Both of these guides have a lot of very similar content. Where they really diverge is that the professional guide offers an opportunity to think about what is your role as a professional, what are things that you and perhaps your organization can think about in making sure that you are supporting the griever and the community in a meaningful way, as well as making sure that you as professionals are being supported. So that's really why there are two, and that's sort of where they diverge, but really the content is the same otherwise. Looking at sort of what is included in here, the first section really focuses on trauma, sort of a deeper dive into what we very briefly did in a few minutes here today. Thinking about terms and how we can talk about this. The second section is about supporting the griever. So thinking of meaningful ways that we can be supportive, and really places the griever at the center of support. So many of the conversations that we had during the Q&A and that we've heard during our speakers' talks are actually in here and in a little bit more depth. The third section is around supporting yourself. How do we put on our oxygen mask before assisting others? How do we place as much value in making sure we are getting the support we need in addition to supporting that griever, to make sure that they feel supported? Because again, we can only show up as our best selves when we are taken care of. The last section really focuses around what are the Jewish traditions around death, really is an opportunity to look at the structures that Judaism offers. These may or may not be things that take place after a traumatic death, but they are many of the opportunities available, and just giving us some common language around what are the traditions in Judaism. And then at the very end of both of these resource guides are 4 activities that are really geared towards anyone. It can be the immediate griever, it can be individuals that are supporting that person, yourself, people in the community. And these are just meant to be tangible ways to practice some of the learning in the resource guide. So these are some of the things that you will see in there. And sort of in line with what Mark was sharing in his slides, each of our sections starts with a Jewish value, one of the 8 mental health midot that the Blue Dot Foundation has to really ground that in Jewish wisdom and tradition in an intentional way and help us make those connections back and remind us why we are having these conversations in Jewish spaces. And our intention really is through education to help break down the shame and stigma that often accompany deaths, traumatic deaths that are happening out of time, to reduce those and normalize that conversation. So how to use these? We hope that in the same way that you take CPR first aid or mental health first aid to familiarize yourself with tools before a crisis happens, we hope that you'll do the same with this. Read through it, share it with individuals, share them with colleagues, so that you know that in a crisis that this is something you can lean back on. You don't have to memorize it. It by no means is the end all be all of this learning or education. It's just a great starting off point to think about how can you continue to do this learning and this work, and how can you share this with people when they do have needs. So in our post email that we will send out, we will have links to both of the guides. We will have links to any additional resources that we talked about today. the link to this recording so that you can share it with others and ways to be in touch with us. And I want to say thank you again to everyone who was instrumental in the creation of this resource guide. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their stories and for sharing their work. And thank you to all of you for taking time to be with us today on this. And as we wrap up, I just want to share with you Amisha Baruch, a prayer for healing. This was written by a group of students at the Columbia Barnard Hillel through one of the Blue Dove workshops. And I think it is beautiful wisdom to end with today. Amisha Baruch for leaders, for any type of leader leading anything. Give them strength when they feel weak. Let them listen to the people they lead. Give them comfort when they feel uneasy. Let them be confident in their abilities. Give them support when they need to support others. Let them feel supported. Let them heal so they can heal others. Amen. Thank you all again for being with us today. We are so grateful.